Well, another bonsai week has flown past in the blink of an eye, and here we are back again together. Scott Martin from Bonsai Matsu, and this is the Bonsai Stuff podcast. As always, it's so good to have the pleasure of your company, and I really appreciate you tuning back in. This episode, we're going to have a chat about checking your pines to see whether it's time to start fertilising post-decandling. There may be some trees out there which are starting to mature and the growth's starting to harden off. There might be some where it's still possibly a little bit soft, a little bit delicate still, maybe still growing, but we're sort of part way into the second month of our autumn period, and we need to make sure that we get enough fertilizer into the tree system prior to going into dormancy. So there's that really difficult period of knowing, do I start fertilizing? Do I hold back? Is it yes? Is it no? Whatever. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk about the upcoming work for pines too, so you can start getting your head around things. A lot of people that listen to the podcast have got pines in one shape or another. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about the work that needs to be done, plus also a few considerations which I think are really important when it comes to working on your pines and thinking about your tree and what you want out of it for later in the year. Specifically, maybe it's something like a bonsai show. Do you treat it differently if it's going into a bonsai show than if it's staying on your bench? Yeah, you certainly do. So I'll talk about that a little bit as well. And then we're going to talk about different types of pines, understanding that there's particularly, needle plucking techniques or needle removal techniques with different pines. So it's a bit pine-based with fertilizer, but that's about where we're ready to step into, and it's an important time. So it's just a bit of a refresher course to get everyone's head right before the big work, the big dance actually starts. So let's get into it. So this applies to Japanese black pines, Japanese red pines that have been decandled. That's specifically what I want to talk about right now. And we'll progress into other pines, of course, as we go. But those trees that were decandled, one of the reasons that we decandle is because we want to get shorter needles and shorter internodes. And if, while they're still growing, you're providing a nitrogen-based fertilizer to them, then you'll find that the needle length can blow out. Doesn't always necessarily happen, but can blow out. But also you will have longer internodes, which for me is the biggest problem. I'm not really fussed about needle length. That sorts itself out over time. So I'm not fussed about that, but I am fussed about internode length, because once you've got long internodes, then you have to rely on back budding to be able to shorten the branches. It does happen, but it's a bit more hit and miss, and maybe not as calculated as what I'd like it to be when it comes to working with my pines, and especially black pines. So you need to be able to determine when's the right time to start fertilising your black pines. And a couple of things you can do with it, as you may have heard, it's been talked about quite a bit by a lot of people. But for me, the one main thing that I work towards for me is the setting of the needles in the sheath. So if you sort of get to those, start with some old needles. They're more olive normally, and then they're further back down the branch, obviously. So if you start with those, and you sort of get a bit of resistance. If you try and grab the pair of needles in the sheath is a white little bit that's connected at the base to the branch or trunk, or wherever the needle seems to be coming from. But if you have a bit of a tug on those needles, the older ones, you'll find there's good resistance. Like they've hardened and they've set in their sheath. When you get towards the newer ones, so the new areas that have grown, just pick one that you know is too long for that area. Don't don't do this on buds that you want to keep when you do our bud selection process in a month or so's time, and just give the needles a bit of a tug. If the needles still come out very easily, and I mean really easily, you'll pull them a little bit and they'll pop out in your hand. If they're doing that, then that's a sign for me that the tree is still growing. It's still in a growth phase. So fertilising now is going to be detrimental, because it's going to push out the needle length and the internode length. if you find that there's resistance there on the needles, maybe not as much resistance as the older needles, but as soon as there's a bit of resistance there, the branch sort of sways and the needles don't come out, or it takes a little bit for those needles to come out, then that for me is a really good sign that, hey, you should be fertilizing these trees. This is where that fertilizing should be kicking in, because you'll have a tree which isn't going to be putting as much into growth anymore, but it's going to go towards that health and strength building, which is a really important part about why we're fertilizing our trees at this time of the year. So black pines need that as well, because come spring they're going to be pushing out like crazy. Hopefully there's some backbudding going on, but what's going to happen with it is that you're also going to need to build the tree's strength up for decandling later in summer when it's coming up. So I find this fertilizing time for them is really important. There's a few things that need to be taken into consideration as I rub my brow while I'm saying this. If you've got a pine that's on the weaker side, and maybe post decandling the buds haven't pushed like you'd expect, like you look at the tree and it's got a feel or a look to it that's maybe not as full, or the needles aren't quite as long as what you'd expect, I would start fertilizing that tree early, regardless of that needle resistance that you've got there. If you look at it and you think, oh, geez, it's still young, it's still vibrant green, it's still, but the buds are quite small, then err on the side of caution and start the feeding process sooner rather than later, because that'll help push the needles along and it'll help push the internode length along as well. The one thing that you don't want is a zero internode length, where you've decandled, maybe the tree wasn't quite as strong as what you thought it was, hasn't pushed out the new candles like you'd expect, so it hasn't responded as favourably as what you'd hoped. And when that happens, that means that you really need to make sure that you're giving it that little bit of fertilizer, that nitrogen, all the goodness that's in those tea bags or whatever method you're using for fertilizing, to make sure that it can grow, that it can push, that it can do what it needs to do to be able to survive the next process. If the needle length is too short, you may have decandled too late, for instance. It's a good indicator that you probably need to review all the pines in your collection. If you look at all of them and think, hey, they're all in exactly the same boat, none of them have really kicked on, then go back and look at the timing of your decandling for those trees, and consider that possibly that's got to change in coming years, because if the decandling period's too short, there's not enough time for those new needles to grow. New needles don't grow. Old needles start becoming useless after about 2 years. So you'll find that the tree gets weakened even further because it just can't photosynthesize. With needles that are too short, the tree will not be able to work effectively and do what it has to do to survive and thrive. So you'll sort of be treading water. So if you see a pine, a black pine, red pine in your collection that you look at and say, that's in that category, I'm not getting the feeling that this tree has done as well as what it could have post decandling, by all means apply the fertilizer early. Don't hold back any longer, because you're gonna need to get this thing across the line before you start doing the autumn winter work for your black pines. So when do you undertake the work on your pines for this work? My requirement before I start doing the work is that real feel that they're very late in towards the dormancy phase, or they're dormant. Now, I don't encourage that on non-pine related species like deciduous, for instance, because anything that's done to that tree during the dormancy period will often result in heartache and cuts not healing or sealing or anything like that. With pines, I love it because that's the time of the year that they're very flexible, that they're pliable, that you can do this work to them without worrying about damaging. You've got to do it correctly, of course, but you're not going to worry about damaging as much of the foliage or the new little buds that are formed just as soon as spring gets there. It's all prior to that work. You can get in, the buds have set, the buds have hardened, the needles have set, and you can get in there and start, plucking and pruning and wiring and whatever else, and getting the work done that needs to be done, so you can have the tree look beautiful before spring gets here. I don't want to be doing this work once the tree wakes up in spring. I don't want to do it while the tree's still developing and growing during the early autumn period, because if I go, let's say there's 4 or 5 buds in one spot, and I clean it back to my mandatory 2 buds, 1 to 2, only 2 things growing at any one point for my pines. If I go back and clean it back to the 2, then, and it's still in the growth phase, then the resources that were going to the buds that I've removed suddenly end up going to the buds that I've got left. Those buds that I left go from being perfect sized buds with perfect needles to suddenly too long, because they're still growing. They're still pushing, the needle length starts to get longer. So I want to wait until after the allocation of growth has happened and the tree has settled and it started to go dormant. So for me, that means it's going to be in a few weeks' time. It's definitely not today. It's not when you're listening. If you're listening to this podcast as soon as it comes out, this is not the time for you to be looking or considering doing the pine work on your trees. You want to hold back a little bit, because it's still going to be pushing. It's still going to be growing. So always hold back and wait for it to finish. So the jobs we're going to undertake: needle plucking. Different parts of the world do different things, and it's whatever suits your climate and your environment. And yep, sure, this is a disclaimer from me again on the podcast, because so many people from so many different parts of the world listen to this, so it's never the same. In Japan, when I was there, it was always down to 5 pair at the nursery that I was at. For me, if I went back to 5 pairs, I'd almost certainly kill and weaken every single pine that I had in my collection. So I work to a needle density as opposed to a number of needles, and that density of needles generally equates to about roughly 12 pair, thereabouts. I don't count, never count, and I try and make it that in my stronger areas I have less density. It's less dense, that area with needles, than the weaker areas. More needles, more strength. Less needles, less strength. So I get to balance that set of scales that I always talk about with all your trees, but particularly pines, right now at this needle plucking time. Bud selection, always come back to 2. Always look for the buds that are growing in the right direction or close to the right direction, that are the right size. Invariably you work your way around a bunch of new buds at the cut site where you've decandled, if you have decandled, that is, of course. But you work your way around. Process of elimination. Get rid of the too big, get rid of the too small, see what you're left with. Come back to 3 or 4 that are roughly about the best size for that tree. I never go to the smallest, I never go to the largest. Of those 4, which ones are growing in the right direction? You'll be able to eliminate one that's probably growing in the wrong direction. You're left with 3. Of those 3, flip a coin. I don't really mind which 2 are left, but you've got to make the decision to get back to 2. Have to. Every single time. Whenever you're working on your trees, 1 to 2 always applies when it comes to your pines. So I'm doing needle plucking, I'm doing bud selection, then I'm wiring and I'm shaping. I'm making sure that my structure is got volume. So be careful that when you're wiring your pines, you don't go for a flattened structure. A common mistake and a common thing that I see is pines being wide, or all trees being wide, where that structure is very flat, like a saucer, like a plate. It's common, it's really easy to do, but try and build some height and some structure where things are coming out on 45-degree angles from the branch. Not straight up, not straight down. Those 45s are just bloody beautiful when it comes to volume on your pads, and use it. Use what you've got there to build some kind of shape on your trees. Clean your pots up when you're working on them. This is always a great time to give them a good scrub down. And different cleaning products are available. Harsh, soft, whatever suits. Soapy water. I wouldn't put soapy water over the top of the pot, but for me, it's just generally a good wet rag. Give them a good scrub off. I don't like anything harsh on the pot that's going to be potentially damaging to the patina that's been building up on the pot. And then, if it's one of these it's one, a beautiful special tree to you, then I find a little bit of baby oil on a rag really gets the pot ready. I use it for getting ready for bonsai shows, but it's also a really nice way to bring out the deepness of the pot and really put it back to beautiful. So if you've got a tree that means a lot to you, that looks fantastic, give it a clean with a wet rag, then get some baby oil on a rag and just gently rub it all over the outside of the pot, and you watch the thing come back to life. But they're pretty much the main things that I look to work on when I'm doing my pines. The other consideration, as I mentioned in the intro, was you've got to think about what's happening next with this pine. So you've got to look at, if you're going into a show for your tree, then what's going to happen is you don't really want the tree to be too thin or showing too much wire, or be hard cut back. Normally when you put a tree on show, the thing's full. It's got lots of volume. It looks great. You are seeing a little bit of the branching, not too much. You're definitely not seeing this big, ugly, heavy wire wrapped around trunks. There might be a few little light guy wires here and there in there to pull the branches in place. So if I've flagged a tree that's going to go into a bonsai show later in the year, when I'm working on it at this time of the year, it makes a massive difference. And this is, we talk about plans for your trees and what you want to develop. This is one of those times where you need to think about, if the tree is going to be shown at some point in the future, flag it now, because I guarantee you'll be disappointed if you've got a show coming up in a couple of months' time and you get in there and you do hard work on this pine and you pluck it within an inch of its life and get it right back. Sunlight's in there, structure's beautiful, wiring's, elegant, it's nice, it looks great. By the time it comes to the show, it's still going to look like a plucked chook. There's not going to be enough there to make this thing look full and healthy. So is it a compromise on, maybe a step forward for the tree and making it the best it possibly can be for the show? Yeah, definitely, 100%. If you look at a lot of trees that go into show that are very, really full, you might see, extra branches, more than what you'd need, more needles than what you'd need on the tree. Maybe some shadowed areas where it's too dense for the sunlight to get in there. There'll be an issue with back budding somewhere down the track. But if I've got a show on and I want to put my best foot forward, then that's something that I'll do, is I'll compromise on my technical side of the work on the tree to make it beautiful, because it's about the viewer's experience when you're putting a tree on display. And for me, I want them to look at the trees and go, that's incredible, and then fall in love with bonsai. And suddenly there's a lifelong passion for a 10-year-old kid who walks in there the first time and sees a tree and goes, oh my God, I'm going to start doing a weekly podcast called Bonsai Stuff and tell the world how good bonsai is every single week of the year. But I'm being funny about it, but that's true. That's what I think when I come to the shows. It's not about long-term compromise. It's about a short-term compromise to maximise enjoyment and satisfaction of people that come along to the show. So you've got a lot to do. You've got deciding whether you're fertilising your pines. You've got, if you are they ready to be fertilised now? Are they weaker than what they should be? Have they not responded like they should have? Should you fertilise them early? Shouldn't you? And then when is it time to do the work on the trees? And when it is time to do the work on the trees, what work are we going to do? So hopefully that's a helpful reminder to sort of push you in the right direction with your pines. Now, I don't know if you've picked this up about me yet, but I love pines as bonsai. I really do. I love them. I love so many different species, but pines are through and through part of who I am when it comes to me and my bonsai and my bonsai journey. I talk about that bonsai journey bit a lot because it's different for all of us, but yeah. A lot of people are saying sort of no shit Sherlock right now, but I do love pines, and I think about them and how they get cared for a lot. And over the years, I've done so much so much of my own research, so much learning, so much delving, so much reading, so much investigating, trial and error for everything to do with pines, and try and work out as much as I possibly can. Do I know it all? No, I'm certain that I don't. But some of the stuff that I've picked up along the way hopefully can help shortcut a few listeners to make sure that their experience is as easy as possible, as smooth as possible. So one of the main tasks that we do with our pines is needle plucking. It happens a lot. Really, you acquire a new pine or a pine at any time of the year. I don't care what time of the year it is. There's perfect times for working on the trees, but one of the things that you can do at almost any time of the year is, and I say almost, I would do it at any time of the year, but I'll throw almost in there just in case something comes up that I'm not aware of or I haven't thought about prior to doing this podcast. Needle plucking is one of the things that you can do almost at any time of the year, because it's where we can balance or help to balance the allocation of resources. As I said before, it's more needles, more resources, less needles, less resources. So if you acquire a tree, it looks really full and thick. The apex, they are dominant at the apex of the tree. That's no two ways about it. I don't think I've ever come across a pine that's not dominant at the apex of the tree. And you cascade them down. What was the apex, something becomes the lowest part, the highest part of the tree, which is then becomes the apex of the tree, becomes dominant. It's not rocket science. That's just how they work. So we can use removal of needles to ensure or to help with that set of scales being balanced out. So if we keep on the path of a cascading bonsai, the tail, the tip, the furthest point, the lowest point always seems to be the weakest. Most often, most common, they don't get enough sunlight down there, and that's part of the reason why they don't do well. It's not because they're below the horizontal or anything like that. It's for me, it's more that they don't get enough allocation of resources because they're lower down. So what you can do is you can use needle removal, and I'm not saying plucking at this stage, but you can use needle removal to force the tree to have less resources allocated around the apex of the tree and leave more needles in the weaker areas. So therefore, more resources get kicked along and pushed down to that area of the tree. Works really, really well. And what I want to, I suppose, focus on for the podcast is to say it's that needle removal technique that matters the most. Right? So you've got to know the species you're dealing with. You've got to know how the tree's going to react. And there are, even with Japanese black pines, I would say 99.9% of the time, needle pluck. But I've come across Japanese black pine that have had the needles set so hard in the sheath that as the plucking process is happening, it's tearing bark off, it's damaging, it's actually ripping from the base of the sheath. So if you find that, and Japanese white pines, right? So Japanese black pines have got 2 needles per sheath. Japanese white pines have got 5 needles per sheath. So as a general rule of thumb, the more needles per sheath, the harder I find they're going to set. So if you're plucking something with 5 needles, then you run the risk. Again, it's not always, this isn't an all or nothing scenario, but you run the risk of doing more damage by plucking than what you would if you needle cut. And that means cutting right down into the sheath. You don't want to cut the needles. Let's say the needles, I don't know, a centimetre long. You don't want to cut it down to 5 or 6 mil, something like that. You want to cut it down to probably 2 mil, 1 or 2 mil. So it's short enough that the tree goes, well, that's dead, stops allocating resources. The needle or the sheath, the remaining part of the needle goes brown. Then it can just be rubbed off somewhere down the track. Doesn't damage the bark. So you're getting, wounds that have to be healed by the tree. So it's got to allocate resources there. And you're not damaging any dormant buds that are hiding below the surface of the bark, which is really important, especially when it comes to white pines. We rely on backbudding with that variety so much that to be going through and causing damage to the bark by plucking instead of doing that cutting process can be so wrong. And again, it's not a hard and fast rule. The older the needles are on a white pine, for instance, the easier they come off. After the period of 2 years, you'll find that they'll go brown and fall off anyway. So if you leave them on the tree long enough, then they'll just come off by themselves. That's great. But as I said, we use the remaining needles on all of your pines to allocate resources. So if you've got a white pine that's got far too many needles hanging around the apex of the tree, that area, the buds will be massive. They will be very strong. The branching structure will be quite thick and coarse, whereas the lower areas where there's not many needles will just stay spindly and weak. It won't have very strong buds. And in fact, you may find that you're getting dieback come after the winter period anyway. So by removing needles in that stronger area, you start pushing resources down to the area where you've left a lot of needles in those lower areas, and it makes such a big difference. And if you come across a 3-needle pine, a radiata pine, which I work with all the time, I find they're sort of 50-50 whether you're needle plucking or you're cutting the needles. Sometimes in different areas on the tree, I find that plucking's easy. I can do it. And the needles, where the needles are a bit on the thinner side, maybe not quite as strong, I find that I can needle pluck in those areas. But when I get areas that are stronger, more dominant, that I can't pluck in that area without doing damage. So I find that some areas on 3-needle pines, I'm cutting the needles off, removing right down to the, just leaving a small section of the sheath and the needles. And in other areas, I find that I can get in there and pluck, and it's not a problem at all. So just test the resistance as you're working through. Look at a branch that maybe you're not going to be keeping, and just practice on it. Just see what the tree indicates to you. But there's definitely different needle removal techniques that you use. One thing you can't get away from is you're going to need a good pair of needle plucking tweezers that have got a really strong tip on them. Pluck in the direction the needles are growing. Never pull them against the direction that they're growing, because you're going to tear them out anyway. But that resistance testing to work out whether it's, is it safe to pluck the needles on this thing? And if you find that there's resistance when you're plucking 2 needles, just go back and pluck 1 needle and just see if that helps you with the needle removal on the tree. Plucking for me is by far the quickest and easiest. And once you get that technique, that sort of chopstick grab pluck technique, over and over and over, you'll find that it's quite easy. So just it is getting to pine time, so there's going to be a few more episodes carrying on about pines over the next couple of weeks to get everyone revved up and ready to go, because it's that's how the podcast works. What's on my mind becomes what's on your mind as well. So I apologise if you're listening to the podcast and have zero interest in pines. Well, I'm sorry, but this is that time for us all. There's a bit going on in the bonsai world when it comes to this period of time, heading towards the midsection of autumn. It's a good time for you to get out there and spend some time with your trees and do a bit of a review and just see where they're at, what needs to be done. Lots of things like checking for pests. Is there any damage being caused? Is there something that needs to be actioned right now? Fertilizing. Make sure your standards. It's important you know that by now. If you've listened to more than about 3 seconds of this podcast. And pines, it's worthwhile having a look to see whether you're going to be starting fertilizing now or not. But it's probably about time that these things start to happen. So it's time to get wide. It's time to get settled in and focused in on pine work. That's definitely coming up. It's a really important time of the year, and you can make such a big difference now with your trees to make them look just beautiful, and it's exciting for me. They've been through this process of decandling. They've been left alone, sitting there idly, and it's almost time for me to jump onto it and start making them look beautiful again. It's really exciting. So thanks for listening in. As always, I love the company. I love the support. Thank you if you are a supporter of the podcast. It means the absolute world to me, and to everyone that's not not a subscriber, please consider it. It's really, really great way to keep the continuity of this podcast flowing. Anyway, until next time, happy bonsai.